This is a sort of a parallel talk to what Juan presented. Hervé Avenot and Sasha Marine did much of the work. We worked near the state line between Virginia and North Carolina. Let me see if I can. Okay, so the state line is here, and so the first location here is in Lambsburg, Virginia, right there where the Blue Ridge Mountains go up, so it's in the lower part there, in the Piedmont of North Carolina, and then two locations here in North Carolina, just across the state line, where we have worked. This is a place where the disease was first detected back in 2011, 2012, and it really went to town. Here is the pictures don't show all that, with all that light in the room, don't show up that clearly, but there is just boxwood blight continuously along this row of boxwoods next to the driveway here. Okay, there we go. So the initial trials were done with what we call plantainers. They are just tubs about this wide where we put them in the field. We put a plant that is sort of our testing object in the middle, and the leaf litter, that's all dead boxwood leaves with some other stuff mixed in, and that should be full of, from infected plants, that should be full of the propagules of the pathogens, Microsclerosia. And then here is the same leaf debris, but it's covered with about 4 inches of, in this case, cypress mulch. In the first year we used cypress mulch, and the second year we had a different mulch, a hardwood mulch. To address that one question, whether it makes any difference, we don't really have any direct comparison, so we can't really tell whether it makes any difference, but I think Juan's hypothesis is pretty well correct, that it doesn't make a whole lot of difference in the short run. Anyway, so we also had some trap plants exposed that were under the canopy, and I'm not going to talk about that too much, but here is an infected boxwood plant. There are some symptomatic areas here in the field, and we put one of these plants in a bucket, one of these smaller plants in a gallon pot underneath that area to see what would happen on a rainy day when the spores supposedly come raining down. And then again, here is the leaf debris, and the leaf debris covered with the mulch. Okay, we also had a weather station sitting there in the field. And here are the data from 2015. So they're fairly small numbers, but you see the plants that were sitting under the canopy, small amounts of, this was all based on visual rating, looking at the symptoms, what looks like boxwood blight. So the number of lesions, the number of spots per plant. And so many of the, since there were 4 plants for each, you get fractional numbers. You might have been 1 leaf on, that looked like boxwood blight on the 4 plants, and that would show up here as 0.3. So 1/4 of a lesion per plant. So you see, in most of the time there is actually, and I grayed out some of the zeros so they wouldn't clutter it up too much, so there was nothing happening in this period here between in July of 2015. Early in the season we did have some infection, substantial here with June 2 to 9, and the debris 171, but the mulch didn't have any. On that, in those 4 plants surrounded by the mulched, covering up the leaf debris. If you look at the averages at the very bottom of the screen, and you may barely be able to see them, but over the whole season, the plants that were planted or that were placed for a week at a time, then brought back to Blacksburg, a new set of plants went out there. The average was 13 lesions for plants planted placed under an infected canopy, 0.6, so yes, there is some infection occasionally, but very low levels of the plants that were surrounded by the mulch, and 17 rounded off the plants that were surrounded by the leaf debris. Oops. Now, one problem in potential problem in 2015 was that those plants in the plantainers, where the leaf debris was supposed to be the only source of inoculum, that they were actually fairly close to some infected boxwood plants, just 15, 20 feet away. And we were concerned that some of the infection that we saw on the mulch plants might have come from insects on a wet day that would have gotten over onto those plants. So in 2016 and 2017, we moved them farther away. They're still not extremely far, but 150 feet away from any other boxwood plants. Same again, so different mulch this time, the hardwood mulch. And here are the data for the first half of the season from 2016. And you see it's kind of the same story, the mulch, very low levels of infection, but it's not zero. And this year also, the leaves were all confirmed by taking the leaves, obviously they were on campus, but putting them in a moist environment for a couple of days and seeing if boxwood blight spores were developed. So these are confirmed positives. The first year they were highly suspected, but not every individual leaf was confirmed, and I'll get back to that in one of the later slides. We don't have the averages here yet, but you see low levels of activity. And then we go to the later part of the season, and late August, in September, several periods with quite a bit of activity. And the average is again at the bottom there. The mulch is not absolutely effective, completely effective, but it does cut down the level of infection by a great deal. This year we got more average infection from the canopy, the plants that are placed under an infected canopy, than from the leaf debris. 2017, pretty quiet in terms of boxwood blight. Most of it looks pretty gray here, gray zeros, and not a lot of infection. We did get some early in the season, and one thing that's kind of interesting is in the middle of the winter. There. We left plants instead of taking them, and in previous years we kind of stopped in November and started back again in April and May. But here we left, and we left them much longer there, we left them for a month, but there was a little bit of infection there actually in the middle of the winter. It can happen if you get mild conditions like we are having here today in Beltsville. Then in 2016, too, we had a larger scale, and Sasha Marine did all the work on that, a larger scale mulching experiment to see, because these plantainers are fairly small, to see if this could work in a field nursery. So this is the location that was used, an infected field nursery with boxwoods. Many of the plants had been taken out over time. And okay, that's the map. So you see the boxwood still sitting around, but we had an area that was fairly clear where it was within a reasonable distance from infected plant where the mulch could be tried. We did have 10 by 10 foot plots, some of them with leaf debris brought from under the infected boxwood plants and spread around there. Some of them with that same material, but then covered with the mulch. We put windbreaks around them because we were worried that some of that leaf debris on a windy day would go blowing into the wrong plots. So that's these plastic barriers that you see here. Okay, so here is the leaf debris on the right, and the plants sitting in a plot inside the plastic barrier. And these were kept there for a couple of months at a time. Okay, that's the basic layout, replicated 3 times, and the 3 treatments, leaf debris covered with mulch, and try to add another layer of protection, leaf debris covered with landscape fabric, and that covered with mulch. This is the thickness of the mulch depth at the end, and let's go on to the data. Man, it was a bust. We did have suspected, we had symptomatic leaves on some of the plants, but when those leaves were incubated, none in any of the treatments That's frustrating for a plant pathologist. If you don't get any in where you're supposed to get, the leaf debris around the plants, there was rain at times, there was wetness at times. It wasn't very wet conditions, but no infection during the early part of the season, June through August, or August through November, even though in these other plots we did get some later in the season. But we just missed the right time. So if we look at the overall summary, 2015 with the small plantainers, quite effective. 2016, quite effective. That 0.7 is probably inflated because not all of those are confirmed, but just based on the symptoms. The mulch very effective in the 2017 small plantainers and extremely effective, but hey, it doesn't matter if you don't get disease, you can't say anything. Now, as Chuan mentioned already, in his case, the dogs were the problem, but what I see around my house and where you get holes in the mulch is raccoons and groundhogs digging those in the mulch as well. So that's a caution. We didn't have those in the plots, but none of this is going to ever work perfectly. Any questions?
We have time for a couple questions.
Would you ever consider using pea gravel as a mulch?
Yeah, I think that would work just as effectively as the cypress mulch and the hardwood mulch. It's enough of a physical barrier that whatever is underneath is not going to splash onto the plants. And the problem would be whenever something starts digging in it and brings some of that material that was under the mulch, actually brings it to the surface again.
Anton, you had weather stations to go with this on a weekly basis. Were you able to tease anything out of the data there about wet periods or amounts of rain or various environmental conditions that correlated with the infection?
Yeah, we don't have a detailed data analysis of those yet, but it's clear, again, as we all know, that it takes rain and it takes prolonged periods of wetness. The main thing to try to tease out is that sometimes you have rain and relatively long periods of wetness, and the current Boxwood blight forecasting system that you can access on the web says, oh, high risk, high risk, high risk, but not much happens. So it's not separating out the low risk and the high risk times properly yet. That's correct. And
Could you repeat what Didier said?
Yeah, Didier said there must be spores also besides the weather, because otherwise you don't get infection. And that's part of why you probably need the long periods of wetness. If it's been dry, there's just no spores, or very few. And it may take a couple of days of wetness to build up that number of spores, and now you start getting infection with additional wetness. That's correct. The question is, mulch doesn't last forever, and how do you recommend remove and replace? I think, basically DDA is right this morning, and he said eventually it's going to be everywhere. And that doesn't mean that it's going to be a big problem everywhere, but once you have boxwood blight, and Chuan mentioned that too, in a particular location, it is not really possible to get rid of 100.0000%. You may be able to get rid of 99% or 95%. And so, yes, whatever remove and replace, the mulch will break down. Hopefully, most of the inoculum underneath the mulch, Chuan provided some data that by the end of the second year, they couldn't detect anything anymore. We have taken some samples on a small scale from some under the mulch, and we couldn't detect the pathogen in there. That doesn't mean it's not there anymore, just at very low levels. There's a very low risk probably of getting it onto plants that have been put in that particular location. but it's not going to be a zero risk. And actually, I would think nowhere in the United States where we have conditions that are basically weather favorable is at this point a zero risk. It's going to show up sooner or later. It may be 20 years from now, but it's going to show up sooner or later if the weather conditions and the conditions are correct.